This is, as I mentioned, there's a lot that's been going on in the past year. I would say it's kind of escalated quite a bit this year on this topic, and I think it affects everything that we're doing. So Vittorio and I thought it would be a good update and discussion. We hope that most of this is discussion, but we did want to kind of start out and talk about what is happening, some of the proposals that are out there, what the blast radius is and what those proposals are aiming to solve, if they're aiming to solve, if they can solve any of those problems. And then we do want to spend a significant amount of the time discussing this. So Vittorio, you want to cover the blast radius?
So there are a number of areas that we take for granted because they are primitives that browsers offer, which we have been using as building blocks for all the various past, present, and possibly future protocols. And unfortunately, some of those primitives are starting to either disappear or behave in a different way, to the point that the protocols that rely on them no longer work as expected. And there are a number of areas that we identified which are affected directly or indirectly, or right today, or we know they are on the crosshair of the browser people. Which I say browser people often, that's not a derogatory term, it's just like a shorthand. So if browser people are here, please don't take it in the wrong way. Okay, and so just to give you a super quick rundown, the third-party cookies, we already know, we already got a taste of it through the same site change of defaults. And the general plan is for third-party cookies to disappear. And the reasons for which the disappearance of most of those primitives is that they can be abused, mostly for tracking users. And so browsers are taking steps for preventing that tracking to occur. And we say blast radius because we are collateral damage. Like, it's not that they're saying, let's screw with the identity people. They're just trying to prevent unsanctioned tracking. And in the process, they are just breaking the toys that we normally rely on. So third-party cookies is already in flight. And there are plans, like Chrome said clearly, that they will stop supporting them altogether within 1 year, and other browsers are along the same lines. Link decoration indicates basically query string. Whenever you add something to your URL in the query string, you are decorating your link. And the reason for which they are targeted is that they can be used, they are used as a way for example, transmitting context information across redirects or across clicks and similar. It's something that the advertisers use, that we also use. We send a client ID, we send a redirect URI, we send scopes. But the idea is there will be measures in the future which, if they see that a web app is using decoration, they might trigger some logic that is not yet fully defined that might flag that interaction is an attempt to track the user, and possible remediations which might break stuff. So you can imagine that if a browser strips your query string from your authorization request, your authorization request will succeed. Bounce tracking is even worse. Bounce tracking is the idea of you can track a user simply by having an intermediate redirect on the path where the user is trying to go. So say that you click a link because you want to go to a certain page. If in the process of clicking that link, you get redirected to a different domain, that domain can harvest pretty much all the context of a request and then just send you back on your way to where you wanted to go, but now you added stuff to your dossier. And browsers, again, are concerned about this, and there are starting to be some early proposals. But the point here is, if a browser decides that your redirect to your SAML identity provider is an attempt to track, then they might prevent that redirect to happen, hence breaking your entire flow. The other things that we have in here are not specifically an attempt to diminish credentials, but diminish primitives, but it's more changing landscape. like there are a number of new proposals for APIs which are not general purpose, like the primitives that I just described, but they are specific to identity. So for example, there's a flag that a domain can say, flip this bit on for indicating that I am a signed in domain. So I'm not trying to track when there is a cookie for me, that cookie is a sign-in session. So that's a specific identity API offered by the browser. And the idea is that by providing some of those new primitives, the limitations on the other primitives that I described will not be as painful. And finally, there is this tendency that we are observing of browsers trying to take a more active role. Like today, you know that browsers offer you password management functionality, they can form fill, they can remember your credit card and similar. In some browsers, Chrome, you can sign in the browser in itself, and then the browser can actually inject identity in the right context and similar. So we have seen some attempt to use that capability on that process. So in other words, like actually having the user agent take an active role in the context of identity flows. So those are roughly the area where we can expect changes and the areas where we might need to do remediation. So either adopt these new APIs if we like them, or do remediation for the primitives that are being diminished. It was longer than I hoped, but I hope it helped. Sorry.
No, all good. And I think, you know, the next few slides, right, we did kind of an audit. And this has happened in various places in different forms, probably for the past year and a half. But we, you know, Vittorio wanted a table, so we made a table, and it's this is, I think, going to be a great reference moving forward. So kind of all of those three major points are primitives that Vittorio just mentioned: third-party cookies, link decoration, and redirects. We called bounce tracking redirects just to be a little bit more precise on what's actually happening. And we map them to sign in and sign out flows, and then also how they interact with access token and refresh tokens. So if we look at kind of all of the different or mainstream flows that are out there today, mix of OpenID Connect, SAML2, and there's still some WS-Fed out there, and then the actual flow that's used, right? So you know, SAML2, very common, redirect plus post, and then we have, you know, same for WS-Fed. And if we look at where third-party cookies are affected, you know, if we look at the bolded yeses, you know, there's a trend here, right? The sign-in itself isn't affected, but anything related to session management, which tends to include logout, is affected, you know, as that's, you know, the third-party cookie is the key when you're doing things like embedding an iframe on an identity provider. So the blast radius for sign-in is small or not at all, right, for third-party cookies, but for logout and session management, it effectively breaks it all. Brian.
Is the SAML single logout assuming some kind of iframe technique, and that's why it's broken? I get hung up on this.
Yeah, we did too. So actually, we were hoping someone would correct us if we were wrong. You know, I think SLO is very hard to implement, and
yes, absolutely.
So yeah, here's our SAML expert with their hand up. Heather.
Oh, good gravy. Never call me a SAML expert, but I've asked the same question often enough. So the SAML single logout by spec does not require third-party cookies. That said, it is really hard to implement well, and so there are a number of sites that use third-party cookies as a shortcut. So it's not standard, but it's not uncommon.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Maybe when we take this table into a more, you know, GitHub style, maybe we should add, maybe we should split the 3 columns into 6 columns and say whether it's spec based or in practice. Maybe that's a good reference.
Yeah, that would maybe at least head off moments of confusion like mine, because my head just went to the normal standard SLO flow and SAML for all its problems wouldn't be broken by the removal of third-party cookies. But it does a little bit sort of beg the question of like how far you want to go with that, because I think any of the sign-in flows if they're being done in an embedded iframe or something like that, could be considered broken as well. And is that an implementation detail? Are you giving me finger guns?
No, as in, like, you are raising an excellent point. The assumption here on this current table is that this all happens top level. As in, the case in which this happens in an embedded browser exists, but is not particularly common as for sign-in, because like sign-in, typically there will be click jackers that will prevent that from happening. Okay. And in fact, we'll see in a short that WebCM is predicated on the sign-in happening on in iframe. But in the general case, that's not what happens.
Makes sense. Then SAML2 logout then is kind of an outlier in how it's considered in the table.
For logout, yes, I specifically sign in because the main point with sign in entering credentials, so click jacking and similar. Then you'll find in here things like background reference tokens, which does occur with iframes. It's not like iframes are bad. It's that the sign in here is considered to be top level. And we almost added also one entry because Hirsch very conveniently added a scenario that does include a sign-in with embedded iframe, but it was just one entry just for B2C. And it was in a different category, which was sanction tracking. So it ended up not being in this table. And also, by the way, none of these, as Tim mentioned, is set in stone. A couple of nights ago, we just hammered it in 15 minutes. Sure. But I'm sure that there will be lots of things to be refined.
Fair enough. I'm just trying to make sense of it myself. And thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, and if you haven't been following this for the past year and a half or so, essentially we started with a big 911 and then started to really drill down on what was going to happen and what the timeline was going to be, right? And so a lot of this has changed even in the past. The timeline has changed, the publicity around it's changed, both from internal and external pressure, and also what is going to be addressed by these proposals has changed significantly and is still, in flight now, right? So that the next time we talk, this entire presentation could be different, but that's why, we're going to recommend you join the FedID CG at W3C, because that's where this is all being discussed weekly at this point. So it's all very much in flight. This is not a static anything.
I have been following it for the last year and a half, and I still don't know what's going on. So, but
yeah, it's fun.
But don't let that stop anyone.
All right, just to pivot real quick over to access and refresh tokens, right? So we kind of broke out usage into three categories: token retrieval, token renewal. So token retrieval is in generally initial token retrieval, then token renewal, and then token usage, right? So starting actually at the bottom, for token usage, right? Standard bearer token via JavaScript. No, none of these primitives are used, right? It's pretty standard. When you get into renewals, when an iframe is involved, that's when third-party cookies come into play, right? And that could be, I had a conversation with Hirsch on the side yesterday. That could also be a cookie-based auth, right? Which we typically don't consider into the sign-in table because it's not using OIDC, or it's using a cookie to get another token. But that would kind of be in the same category as the background token renewal in an iframe, which does depend on.
That's it. That's totally what we do normally. Like the main thing is like some people will come and say, oh no, we don't do this anyway because we deprecated implicit. But unfortunately, that's not enough. Let's say that we still have flows in which you do prompt equal none and you ask for a code inside an iframe and you rely on the third-party cookie being there so that prompt equal none actually works. So even with no cookie, with no tokens involved, at least in the request, we still have this scenario with the iframe. And Pixie does require third-party cookies if you'd like it to do it silently. And as the team mentioned earlier, we distinguished between retrieval and renewal, which is a bit hairy, I recognize, but the first one is supposed to be possibly interactive, and the renewal instead isn't. So yeah, with no iframe, like unless called out in the use case or in the flow, we don't assume the iframes.
Brock.
Hi, sorry to keep harping on this. Can you go back one slide? My apologies, because I feel like everyone else knows this and I feel like I'm missing something fundamental. So the very first two records in there, implicit or code flow, you're saying that across the site boundary, they are or not going to be removing third-party cookies from that scenario?
The main point we are saying is you don't need third-party cookies in that context. Let's say that when you are doing these flows, you are just doing redirects. So apart from the various considerations that we had with the same site, with the nonce cookie being a first-party cookie, but being blocked because the redirect starts from a different domain, apart from that particular case, which is not strictly third-party cookies, you don't need third-party cookies in order to successfully perform the flows in the first two rows.
But if you have a session at the IDP and you're in across a site at a client application and initiates the redirect, you are to the authorized endpoint, you absolutely are relying upon your third-party cookie. Doesn't it start in the client? It gets sent to the authorized endpoint across the site boundary, and that immediately will then send you back. So why is that not dependent on the third-party cookie?
Because those are not third-party cookies. If those are first-party cookies, it just happened to have a different origin.
But the client on site one is the one initiating the redirect to site two. And therefore, I thought the whole point of this exercise was that Google says that is tracking the user. Therefore, we won't send the cookie to site two, which is the IDP site, if site one initiates the redirect. And again, I can take this offline if I'm sidetracking.
Yeah, we should take this offline because I think that we had a similar discussion actually with Brian and George in the past, in which we were talking about exactly how this redirect is originated from a different website and how does this apply.
This is the exact same issue that happens with the typical nonce cookie management when you're redirecting back from the IDP. So I don't see how that's too different than the actual session cookie at the IDP initiated from cross-site client.
Yeah, we should expand on this and see what this thing looks like. I know from practical terms that the nonce cookie does have a problem, but not the session one. And right now, I cannot conjure the details of why that is the case. And also, I remember the discussions about these not really being a third-party cookie problem, more about extra constraints about first-party cookies in particular circumstances, such as redirect originating from a different domain. That doesn't make that cookie become a third-party cookie. It's still a first-party cookie that has extra constraints. So I take that we might have a problem in here, but the problem is not third-party cookies.
Yeah, I think that discussion was part of when all of this was lumped together, all three of these columns were lumped into one big question mark. I think that went with the redirect work that is pushed off a few years. So it's certainly something that's going to bite us at some point, but it's not in this first phase.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
They don't consider that third-party cookies in the definition of what they're going after now, at least as I understand it. Those are cross-site cookies on the top frame, and those might come under attack later with link decoration and redirect stuff. But for the sake of the third-party cookie deprecation, as far as I know, those are not in the crosshairs currently.
So the third-party cookie deprecation is obviously for iframes.
Iframes and XHR and fetch, yeah.
Yeah, but anything that's loading content underneath from within the page that's not
okay.
the top
I think
navigation, but
okay, I think that answers my question then. So
as far as I know,
top level browser redirect cookies are allowed to be sent cross site, modulo the same site setting that came a few years ago. And the fact that
Yes.
Safari also, okay.
That-
Okay, thank
yeah.
you.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the ITP dimension, I think, adds more confusion. So
Okay, so this
Absolutely.
makes me far less scared than I was, 2 or 3 days ago.
good. A happy
Well,
customer of the call. I love it.
Well,
You never know what's going to happen. So
Yeah.
keep
Yeah,
that fear ready in the
yeah,
cache.
no,
without,
Yeah.
okay.
All right.
All right. And given that if we're in a lot, let me just stress the reason for which we are so hung up on third-party cookies is that they are the only thing for which today we know for sure they are going away. Link decoration and redirect are risks at the horizon, but we have no details and we have no details. And so the main thing that has the potential to disrupt existing flows is mostly in third-party cookies.
Yeah, and the assumptions we're making, I don't know if you can actually, is drawing? No, it's not. I think the assumptions we're making right now is third-party cookies is within the next 12 months, likely sooner. Link decoration and redirect is one big bucket that is 24 to 36 months, right? It's kind of a bit of a, or I should say 12 to 36 months, depending on how it gets broken down. It's a big black hole, unfortunately.
So the short of it is Chrome is basically catching up to what Safari did 2 or 3 years ago in the next year.
Yeah, and I do think to give them credit, I think they're doing it in a the process is a little bit better, right? Because the one thing that happens with ITP that makes it frustrating is everything is an input to ITP. The output is never predictable, right? The action that's taken can change at any point. It's by design, not something that if you ask a question like this input and even some of these new specs that are coming like is logged in, if you ask how will this impact ITP, it's not going to be this is the output. It's going to be we're going to take that into account. All of these things with ITP are taken as signals. And I'm not trying to speak on behalf of WebKit, but that's how we've perceived this to date, is that these are all inputs to this big engine, and they're not binary responses.
Okay,
but whereas Google is trying to take, Chromium is trying to take an approach of creating new APIs and other things so that the output is predictable.
Okay, so then I'll ask a question that I meant to ask on all of the OIDC, extra calls that we did over the last year, is that given that Safari has already taken this measure and the ship has sailed, then why aren't we just changing our identity architectures to accommodate it? Because that's at least 10% of the user population. Therefore, if you can't use iframes for renewal and all these other things, then for 10% of your users, your architecture is fundamentally broken, in my opinion, right? You can't just have 10% of your users work and the rest. So in other words, like I said, it's sort of like the ship has sailed on this because Safari already did it 3 years ago.
Well,
I don't know about that. I mean, I certainly have personal opinions on that, but I don't think 10%.
Yeah, but I mean, that's back to.
I'll leave it at, I don't think 10% of the market is going to move the needle.
Yeah. But actually, here, like Brock, you're right. Like these third-party cookies demise is gonna happen, absolutely. But between Safari already done it, so we are done already, and actually this thing rolling out, there is a big delta. Let's say that for years, SharePoint had the security zones, and people said, "I'm trying to do this and didn't work." And for years, I told them use Chrome. So today, a lot of people I know, when they were using Safari, they were told use Chrome. The moment in which Chrome started not allowing these as well, then the problems we'll have will be at an entirely different level. But we moved early on these. And so, for example, we know that if you go to the next slide, so that we have thank you. So here in the first in the two token renewal, we have one case which is affected, in which if you try to use the iframe, these won't work unless you use custom domains and similar. But if you use refresh tokens, it will work. And we know that that carries a lot of extra pain. You need rotating refresh tokens. You need potentially sender constraints, this mythical thing that everyone talks about and no one has. But anyway, the main point is we are taking steps. if you're looking at the SDKs across the industry, we now have a lot of support for using refresh tokens in the browser, which we didn't have before we had all these cookies madness, despite of the fact that today those cookies still work. So you're right that we need to change what we are doing today because there is no way around this thing. The challenge is that the numbers are non-trivial because with 10%, you can still tell people go and use a different browser. How many which 90% instead is doing this, then things that today we are not hearing too much, like I'm trying to do distributed logout and I fail, we'll start hearing it. And it's gonna be a problem because like not being able to do distributed logout is a security issue. So there are discussions about should we switch to the server-side flow. There are also discussions about getting the browser to pop out a dialog which says, hey, this site is trying to redirect and it claims it's for signing out purposes. Are you gonna allow this? So this idea of prompts, you'll see it in a few slides when we talk about like the storage API, for example. Like those could be some mitigations that we could put together, which don't necessarily require changing. I think that the thrust behind this particular session, and then I'll stop talking, is third-party cookies is just the dry run, is very HRSA. The moment in which we get bounce tracking, then that's when we are gonna see the big asteroid coming our way, because that's where SAML will start breaking. And so I think that as an industry, we should start exercising this muscle. We should come together. We should create forums. We should find ways of engaging with the browsers so that when the discussion is a higher stakes, then we are prepared. So today, like the third-party cookies will survive it somehow. The redirect, if we don't do a good job, we're gonna be in serious trouble, in my opinion.
Heather, I saw you come off mute. Say something.
No, Vittorio covered it.
Okay. All right, so we keep referencing proposals. Let's look at what they are really quick. So there's essentially 5, active work items, I would say, across various groups. Login status API, which is formerly known as is logged in. Some of these have been renamed. The storage access API, which has kept the same name through its life. First party sets, cookies having independent partition state, which is commonly called chips. And then federated credential management, which is formerly WebID, but to be more precise, it's a slice of the former WebID proposal. And if we dig into what those are and what they do, these are meant to be short summaries, so we may it may not convey the whole story, but we tried to do our best to keep it neutral. The login status API, right? What it does is it allows websites to inform the browser of the user's login status, right? So flip a bit to say, hey, I am, this user with this username or this ID is signed in and then potentially is signed out, right? So that's an example of something that could be an input to, let's say, ITP and WebKit for various purposes of clearing site data or other things, right? So they may say, once a browser flips this bit, maybe ITP goes in and clears site data after 7 days, right? So that it's more of a signal. And one of the thoughts is, obviously abuse comes up, like, what are sites going to use this bit for? These are tagging. The thought is, could you hook into other browser primitives like WebAuthn and password managers, so that there's a little bit more assurance when that bit gets flipped, right? So it's probably the least complex of these proposals, but it does have, it does have the ability to provide a signal into the browser. Storage access API, right? Really the goal is to enable content in an iframe to request access to website data, right? So that could be cookies, local storage, whatever it may be, and that's via a prompt, right? And that is implemented today in GA in production in Firefox and Safari, and a little bit of, it varies in its behavior. At the end of this deck, by the way, there's a slide for each of these that takes you to the proposal and goes a little bit more in depth. So that'll take you to the Safari and the Firefox links. And really what that helps with is granting access to cookies and other local artifacts in the iframe, right? So you can imagine a box that pops up. You've probably actually seen it. It pops up and says, especially on Safari, it's very much, centerized there. And asks you, unfortunately, it's a bit of a scary box. And that's one of the concerns with using it for sign-in flows. It use heavy use of terms like tracking, and that dialogue cannot be customized today. So that is actually one of the open work items in that for that spec is, is there a way to declare that this is an identity flow that could potentially tweak the text or provide a consent text blob or something like that, right? Because right now, there's been some cases where it accidentally triggered for some very large properties and sign-in flows, and it caused a lot of craziness because it's unfortunately a very scary dialogue. First-party sets is less active, right? So it's actually more of a browser backend thing where a bunch of domain names can actually declare themselves as first-party, right? So first-party sets kind of redefines what first party means. So you could say a good example is, if you're familiar with our ecosystem at Microsoft, we have SharePoint.com, we have Office.com, we have login.microsoft.com, Xbox.com, you name it. They're all Microsoft and they all use login.microsoft.com. Do those really need to be treated differently if we're redirecting back and forth and loading content across them, right? So the idea is that Microsoft.com can declare itself the owner, and all of these other domains can essentially, you do a pairwise relationship between them to say, Microsoft.com declares themselves as the owner, and you as SharePoint.com confirm via, let's say, a well-known URL that I indeed am owned and in the same set as Microsoft.com. And that can be a mix of well-known URIs. It could be static in the browser. It could be admin policy, right? So that's all still being worked out. FPS is one of the more controversial ones. There's not universal agreement on whether this is good for the web. And if you look at the slide afterwards, you'll see the different positions by the browser vendors. It is certainly one of the more active proposals, right? There's a lot of discussion going on. How do you prove, should it be all sites in the set have to have the same privacy policy, right? So it's getting into more of the political and privacy discussion now and less technical, which is good because that discussion has to happen. But ultimately what it gets you, right, is it could potentially, again, this could be an input into the browser's tracking engine to preserve third-party cookies across those domains that share a set. Chips is probably the newest, second newest, I guess. And cookies having independent partition state. And the idea here is that you can take a third-party cookie that's embedded in an iframe and essentially bind it to the top level frame. So dual key that cookie, so that if I am a cookie for SharePoint.com that's embedded inside Teams.Microsoft.com, that cookie will only be valid when that frame is hosted inside Teams.Microsoft.com. Right. So this one has a lot of promise. In terms of allowing third parties to exist, but restrict them to their home frame for all intents and purposes. So that could allow third parties to continue working without maintaining this tracking vector that exists today. Brian.
I'm super confused about like the motivation of chips. A while back, Mozilla, I think, announced that they were going to just go ahead and partition third-party state by top level, and like it just started working that way, or maybe is going to, or it's something you opt into. I can't remember, but I don't understand why there's a proposal to make it like a server-side opt-in instead of just something that the browser starts doing when they block third-party cookies. Or
yeah, as far as I understand, so the quintessential use case that's actually used in the explainer is the intercom chat thingy that's at the bottom of like AmericanExpress.com, right? So if you change pages, that refreshes, and if you don't have the cookie, you lose the chat, right? So just being able to drop a chat ID that only works on that site and can't be tracked when you go to intercom on another site. So those are the types of things they're trying to preserve. Same with like a store locator, right? Where you put in your zip code on an embedded frame, and you want to remember that when you come back to the site. So those are the types of use cases. I don't see this being heavily used on the identity side for various reasons. Like these are very specific use cases they're trying to preserve. But we did want to call it out because it is another tool somewhere in that toolbox. I agree with that. That's a great point, and unfortunately I don't answer.
Okay, yeah, I guess I'm just I maybe don't follow it. It seems like, or maybe do you know then if when they say deprecating third-party cookies, does that mean blocking them entirely? And then you would have to use chips to opt in to doing it?
I think it's there's ultimately various proposals that can give you limited third-party cookie access, but that's going to be browser by browser. So we actually should have started with this, right? Nothing we've been talking about for the past year and a half is a one size fits all. I think John Willender really actually from WebKit really highlighted it well, right? It's going to be like, to solve this use case, you need A, B, and D, right? And for this use case, you're going to do C, D, and E, which is unfortunate, but I think it is the reality of web APIs at this level, is that you're not going to have one single one that covers all the use cases. And I think that's an important point to bring up, right? The reason that some browsers aren't supporting storage access API, as an example, is they believe that that is too high level of an API in the way cookies were used. Like, it's not specific enough and is ripe for abuse in the future, right? So the thinking is like, you can have very specific APIs for very specific purposes that can only be used for that purpose, and hopefully can never be abused. So it's a different design philosophy, and I think that's why we're ending up with so many proposals. But I think these are the 5 that we think will ultimately stick in some way, shape, or form for use cases like these. And I think so WebKit, someone else keep me honest, WebKit, I believe in 2016, 2017, rolled out the same thing as Firefox and then rolled it back because they had major issues. There's a blog post about it. I'll try and dig it up. But I haven't heard the same issues from Firefox. So as far as I know, they're leaving it enabled.
Thank you. I think I'm still missing something, but it's not for you to answer, so I'll let you go. Move on. Thanks.
But that's a good one. Maybe you can bring up unfortunately Firefox can't attend every time, but it may be a good one to bring up anyway on our call. Okay, and the last one, FedCM, I call it FCM, but I think it's officially FedCM, Federated Credential Management. This, as I mentioned, is kind of it officially was a rebrand of WebID, but if you read the original WebID explainer, this is a very small subset of what WebID is, or was, I should say. And I think that's important, right? Because if we look at, WebID was originally this beast and freaked everyone out because it was getting into like directed identifiers and like mediation and like issuing their own tokens in the browser. And it was like, holy crap, that's where, I think in the end of the day, it was good because it caused us all to get together and start looking at the problem. But luckily it's now scoped down a bit into what is now called Federated Credential Management, which is ultimately will be essentially a subset of the existing credential management spec that's out there. And really what it does is the big thing is it's user agent mediation of identity flows, right? So, it's interrupt driven in a way, right? So things like, the storage access API prompt, for example, might be similar to that, but now it's going to be an identity specific and a sign in or sign up specific prompt, right? And so what that gets you, if you do go through this flow and you do invoke this API, is in theory, it will give you cookie access for iframes and XHR and fetch requests because you've gone through some form of consent that was prompted by the browser, and the browser can unblock certain access based on how you kind of enter, how the site entered the flow and what the user did. That is a very, very short summary of what it is. But
can I add a bit of color to that?
Please,
especially for this particular crowd. Basically, whereas the other things that team introduced operate at the level of one particular feature, primitive, and similar, and sure, they might have a bit of involved syntax, like for first-party sets, you need every domain to expose a little piece of JSON and similar. So it's not just you call an API, you're done, but the FedCM is at an entirely different level. Let's say that the FedCM actually is a substitute for a number of the flows that we are doing, and it has strong assumptions about how authentication occurs. So, for example, it expects that you will get an ID token that is visible by the user agent. The user agent will save this ID token somewhere and will share it with a relying party at the moment of its choosing. And so this is not a small remediation that says, okay, on one side, I make cookies harder to use, but here there's how you can manage your exception. Here is the analogy that I like to use is if you want to keep being able to lower the window in your car, you need to buy a new car. And sure, then you'll be able to lower the window, but now instead of gasoline, you have to find the supercharger and stuff like that. So it's a big change. And today it's positioned as if you want to sign in an embedded iframe, this will allow you to do it. But if, for example, you are signing in at top level and your problem is that you want to be able to do distributed sign out, FedCM won't help. Let's say that either you buy the entire car or you want to be able to do that particular thing that you're trying to do. So I don't mean it to come across negative. I agree with everything Tim said. WebID started as a terraforming project, killing all the existing life forms and substituted with alien one. And now instead it's much, much smaller. It's more of like, let's do city planning in a different way. But it's still very impactful for us that are used to use those other primitives with no constraints and being able to build the protocols the way we want to build it instead of using one defined by someone else. Does that sound fair, Tim?
Yes, thank you. I expected all the hands to go up for FedCM, but no.
Yeah. Okay.
FedCM brokering identity seems to go against the purpose of giving the user more protection against tracking. Rather, it's concentrating the tracking into your browser. Yeah, and I think that is why we had on the blast radius slide, right? There is a, you know, and this for whatever reason is a controversial thing. It's pretty clear to me. I mean, there is a change in, you know, we've added a new active party to identity flows, right? Obviously, the browser could have seen everything before because they're doing TLS and they're everything hits the browser. But there's a huge difference between passive pushing a packet and actively inspecting, right? And you know that is a significant change. I think depending on who you ask, some folks don't think that's a big change. I think most people in the identity world that we've talked to do think it's, you know, the people who are writing specs where, you know, roles are very clearly called out in an identity flow as a huge change. And I think that still remains a concern. Yeah, I guess that's all I'll say.
I think it deserves like connecting the dots further. Like the next logical step for me is today we have this cadre of entities that come into play in our identity flows that we don't identify with identifiers or roles, entities, artifacts in our protocols. If a browser were to take the active role that it has, I think that we should either start modeling it as a native client or actually create a role for it. And then when we have our privacy consideration, our security consideration, and similar, we should expand our description of the scenarios to explicitly account for the browser taking those steps. Because otherwise, today they kind of like operate with the Thanos glove, in which they are above all these rules and they can pick and manage in whatever way they want. And of course, from their stance, they are trusted because it's themselves and they trust themselves. But it's not obvious that developers and users would have to trust them, especially if you start roaming stuff. Because now if you start caching things in the user agent and now the stuff starts appearing in other devices, you can imagine that the attack surface and the threat model becomes one level of magnitude more complex.
Rock, as a co-chair of the Fed ID group, I'm not going to answer that question, but if someone else wants to chime in on that.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, this isn't the elephant in the room, is it not? From the, I mean, maybe this is not the forum for such a question. I don't know.
I think that it's fair to say that this gets a bit into like, I think that we should make an effort to look at the actual technical discussions that we are having and seeing everybody's moving parts, the possibilities. So in terms of where is this information being saved? Now, who has access to what are the kind of attacks that might come into play? If this particular actor turns evil, then what is the thing that they could do? And then we all have our own read of the events at the macro and at the business level, but I think it's not very productive to bring it at this level. And I think that there is enough on the security and pure protocol and threat modeling perspective to add a lot of discussions without necessarily having to assume bad intent. And Brock, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Here, I'm basically telling you how I try to conduct myself about this. I'm just describing my own personal policy. Then whatever policy you want to assume for yourself, of course, you are free to do whatever you think is appropriate.
Yeah, and I think one interesting thing to be aware of if you're not familiar with W3C, right, is these proposals are almost always written in the context of the browser is acting in the best interest of the user, right? So just we can agree or disagree on that, but that is the background of how these proposals come into being. All right. So our call to action, we've already mentioned a few times, but we do, if you're not familiar, we did create a community group at W3C. Thanks to Heather for everything to get that going. It was quite the multi-month process there. So that we've been meeting, it seems like every other, so we rotate time zones, and it seems like every week, but we meet quite a bit, and we have GitHub, and we have very lively discussions going on. We have a Slack in the W3C community Slack. So really what we would like you to do is, if you can, join first and really help us create artifacts, right? We're trying to document use cases and protocol flows, right? So they're very generic use cases, right? They don't have to be specific to your org. You can genericize them because that's ultimately what we're hoping, that proposals that do come into this group, that do get submitted to the group, we can, use these use cases as a checkbox to say, actually, it won't work for these 7. Heather.
One thing I wanted to add, and that is so that there's the Federated Identity Community Group, obviously, which, I'm very fond of. And it's really focusing on the identity flows that enable federation, right? Of the projects that you saw on that list, chips and first-party sets and storage access API, all of them except FedCM are actually being discussed in the privacy CG. Which is a group that has it's a different focus. It's not worried about the auth flows as much as it's worried about the privacy of the user. So it makes sense. These groups are complementary, but they are different. So if you are particularly interested in chips, then if you're looking for that discussion, go to the privacy CG or first-party sets, etc.
Sorry, I'm just updating these because I'm going to send them out right after. So, and FedCM currently is in YCG, which is like the incubator team, incubator group. But there is a current proposal for that to become a work item in our community group. And just so you're aware of W3C process, community groups can create artifacts and proposals, but they cannot take a document to like proposed standard. So essentially, hopefully FedID working community group, becomes where most of the lively discussion and iteration happens. And then at that point, once we all agree that it's ready to move on, it will go through like the formal standardization process, likely in Web App Stack, which is a formal working group that can produce specs. And so, yeah, any type of anything you can contribute is helpful, right? Anything, any analysis you've done of your own deployments that things have broken, anything is helpful. You don't have to join the call, right? You can throw it in Slack, you can throw it in the email list. Heather had a great point. If you're unable to join the community group, which, just so you're aware, the community group has much less restrictions than a working group, so it's much easier to join. There's less process, but if you still can't join, you please email whatever you're willing to say or contribute to Heather, and we'll kind of take care of it from there. This group really came to being from an information gathering process that Vittorio and George started and moved to OpenID, and then we felt we weren't getting a good enough mix of the industry in OpenID because the browsers generally don't come to OpenID. So that's why it ended up at W3C as kind of the middle ground. And we did a lot of discussion in here. As I mentioned, I'm going to send these out. There's a little bit more of a breakdown on each of these, and also a link to the specs. So I'll drop this in the chat after the call. But we still have 7 minutes or so if there's any other discussion. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat. Is anything in the chat worthy of talking out loud here?
I don't know. I'd like to ask the people here, given that we have this high bandwidth, like I'm worried about this. Like I know that there can be in our industry a bit of a bystander effect. Someone is hurt and you see that there are others. If you are alone, you're gonna help the person. But if you see others there, you might, someone else will help. And I think that in these discussions with the browsers, we have seen a lot. Like ultimately, it's been always the same that have been driving these aspects. The thing that I'm wondering is why. I know that we are all busy, that we don't have a lot of budget and similar, but this thing is something that the moment in which bounce tracking happens, we are all going to be in a world of trouble. So why didn't we have more engagement? Is you, I wish we would have had the poll. Is you going to do something after this presentation, as in like joining the group and similar, or was entertaining because the Italian accent and moving hands? And say, if I can ask whomever is going to do something as a result of this presentation, can you raise your hand in the Zoom? Danny suggests, how are you doing a lot of stuff?
Hi, I plan to try join the working group, the
That's
community
wonderful.
group, and see how I can participate.
Thank
I
you.
love your picture, by the way.
Thank you. It's confused many people who actually thought they were on mute.
And no one else. That's very depressing.
Yeah, the one thing we say probably on every CG call as well, like if you just have something that you think is a problem, create a GitHub issue with the title, and you don't need, like if you can't fill it in, you don't have time, fine. At least it'll get logged and someone else it'll trigger something and we can work on it, right? So don't think you have to spend 10, 20 hours on it if you can't. So.
Yeah.
Are those hands like raising because you're participating, or do you want to talk?
Since we're now at the free form
Yeah.
part of our show. One of the things that I do for fun is I have these kinds of sessions, but towards a different type of audience. This is very much a technical audience. I've been presenting this to librarians, to CIOs, to people who influence budget, such that if you need time, you need your company to actually let you do such a thing. I've been doing a lot of that kind of outreach as well. Having, either, sector calls with scholarly publishers, or small group calls with the National Institute of Health, whatever it takes to get the resources needed to have increase participation. So if that kind of help would be useful, please feel free to let me know.